Yeah, I know, but
Who else is on it?
yeah, they're not on here.
Yeah, big help.
Can I ask a process question?
Yes, wait, we're live, just a minute. Well, welcome, everyone. It is Thursday, May 22nd, and you are joining us in the House General and Housing Committee. And the first item on our agenda today is a walk through the latest CHIP amendment proposed and its relationship to the Ways and Means Amendment. And we have with us John Gray, Legislative Counsel, Office of the Legislative Counsel. And my intention is that when John, who is with us for about 30 minutes or so, is done with his walkthrough, that we can have committee discussion and a straw poll on this item. John, would you like to introduce yourself for the record and take it through?
So
I'm so sorry. Would it be helpful for our part-time committee assistant to know all of our names? Just to go through real quick.
Sure. Why don't you start?
We've already met, but actually Bartley, and I serve Fairfax in Georgia. Leonard Dodge, Essex.
Joe Parsons, nice to meet you.
Not Charles.
Debbie Dolkin.
Gail Pezzo, welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome, Mary Howard.
Good morning, I'm Elizabeth Burrows.
I'm Emery Mathias, your temporary committee assistant.
Oh, Emily Krasnow,
And I'm Mark Mahal. So welcome.
welcome.
All right, John.
I'm John Gray.
And also everybody, I've asked Emery to arrange to have the latest amendment printed. Although I think we can find it on our screen. I sent it all to you yesterday, but I thought it'd be nice if we have them printed. I'm just not sure exactly the moment that they'll be distributed. So we'll see.
One quick question.
Yes,
As far as process, are we straw polling the original Ways and Means
No.
amendment, just this one?
this one as amended, yeah.
Can I ask a question
Yeah.
about that? So, but on the floor today, the Ways and Means Amendment is being read.
First. But then the amendment to it, then we will be asked for a straw poll. I've checked this out with, with
Wait.
everybody. We will be asked for a straw poll. In other words, first it'll be us, then
Mhm.
Ways and Means, then the amendment to the Ways and Means. Then I think that we will be asked for our straw poll on the amendment first, and then we'll vote on that.
But I don't think that's what's on our house calendar.
That's why I was confused.
The House calendar has
Been amended.
the amendment on it.
Yeah, correct.
Amendment.
But it has, okay, yeah, so it doesn't, so it's. S-127, Rep. Mahali for general and housing, Rep. Kimball for Ways and Means,
Right,
Rep. Nero for appropriations, Rep. Kimball et al. Amendment.
right.
So don't we have to take a straw poll on the Ways and Means and appropriations?
I was told
amendment?
we do not. And that I think frankly, what would happen is if the amendment to the Ways and Means amount fails, and then we are left with the Ways and Means amendment, if there is no other amendment offered, because, you go with the last amendment, if there's no other amendment offered at that time, I think we might have to at that point, but I was told at this point, no.
That doesn't seem very transparent.
Okay,
Shall I? Yeah. So, I also don't know what's happening on the floor, but the way that this amendment is drafted is it is offered as an amendment to the Ways and Means Amendment. And it's striking sections 25 through 27. So this pulling out the tax increment financing pieces of that amendment and replacing it in total with this. So if you want to see the whole of the CHIPS program, you look here. There's just a handful of changes in this, but I'll try to scroll a little bit slowly through this so if people have questions, but just to note, I will have to run through the Senate floor for the ed bill. So the first changes are in the definitions section. And honestly, this is on page 4 is where you're going to see the first updates. The first changes are more tonal than substantive. So previously, the House Ways and Means Amendment had a concept of affordability that was about middle income housing developments. Because the covenants that can be used to achieve this can target different income groups, it wouldn't necessarily have to be middle income. It's just been changed to say mixed income. So just a tonal shift that we think is, perhaps more accurate as to what the actual
I
intent.
have to interrupt you for just one moment. Emery, have you been unable to get to Saudi or her? He's working on it.
Yeah.
I'll be sending them my YouTube link.
Great, okay, thank you. Please go ahead.
Yep. So changing from middle to mixed income, and we'll come to the purpose section where there's a light update, and I'll explain a little bit more about the shift as well. So on page 5, your purpose section, the purpose of the pilot program is to encourage the development of new primary residences for households of low and moderate income across both rural and urban areas of all Vermont counties. It would not be created but for the infrastructure improvements funded by the program. The changes here from the Ways and Means proposal are, one, we previously called out middle income households. You can't call out mixed income households because the households themselves are not mixed income. It would be the development itself that is. So we have the older reference to households of low and moderate income, which is still the animating principle. But the real substantive shift here is this across both rural and urban areas of all Vermont counties. So making clear that the purpose is this is meant to be widely distributed across the state. And one instance of, lest you think that this is merely a rhetorical change, the purpose is pulled into a couple of sections of the bill, right? And one of those is the rulemaking that VEPC undertakes to prioritize particular applications. And so this could have a meaningful effect on the prioritization that they do. We can skip past. Yep.
Could or would have a meaningful effect on their.
It could, it has a meaningful effect on their process. It is up to VEPC what rules they produce, but they will have to take into consideration this purpose. So they now have the explicit directive to consider this across both rural and urban areas of all Vermont.
Okay.
But it is ultimately up to them what rules they propose. So I cannot predict what they will do. We can skip past sections 1908 and 1909, which are how you create an infrastructure project and site and your housing infrastructure agreement. There aren't any proposed changes to these sections in this amendment. But when we come to section 1910, there are some quite, and I'm sorry, yeah, we're on page 8. There's some quite meaningful changes to section 1910. So the first of these is not visible because it is a deletion, but you'll recall that there was the board, the CHIP board had been stood up in this bill. And part of what Ways and Means had the board doing was VEPC would go through its application process and submit a recommendation to this CHIP board, who would then double check the work essentially, and they would approve it within a particular time period. The board concept has been removed entirely. So in this amendment, it's just VEPC approves tax increment financing for these projects, and they do the work. There's a change we'll come to later that tries to address some of the animating reasons for having the CHIP board in the first place, which is that folks had an appetite to have some housing expertise touching these, right? So we're going to see later an amendment to the membership of VEPC's board solely for the purposes of CHIP to add some housing expertise to those sections. So the first thing here in this section, section 1910, is the removal of the board, which resulted in some reorganization of the section. The next big change is going to be another invisible thing because it's a deletion, but following the process requirements and before the project criterion, these are the hoops that a project has to jump through, right? We used to have a location criteria section, which shunted projects to particular areas of the state. You could only access tax increment financing for housing infrastructure projects if they fell in particular areas. There are no location criteria in this proposal, so CHIP projects are eligible anywhere in the state. You could pursue them anywhere in the state in this concept.
Yeah, do you have a question? You're just enjoying your hand. Right. Yes,
I ask a question, or just, can you really briefly on page 8,
Yes,
go over the but-for test again?
yes. So the but-for test, it actually is a really good thing to remind because people often narrow this in ways that are, don't do justice to the test. So the test asks two different things. It says, determine whether the infrastructure improvements proposed to serve that site and development would not have occurred as proposed in the application or would have occurred in a significantly different and less desirable manner than as proposed. So it's not simply that it couldn't happen without it. It would have been much worse without the tax increment financing. So that is part of the Buckford test analysis. And there are specific.
So John,
Yep.
I need a little help too here too. I want to just. So let's say, I mean, this is often backbone, what we call backbone infrastructure, major roads or sewer or water. So let's say that an applicant can demonstrate, let's say it emerges that the sewer for this project or the road leading wouldn't happen. Well, then that clearly meets the but-for test. But let's say it would happen, but smaller and not sufficient to serve the development as per public safety standards. Is that what that means, that that's less desirable?
I think that would be a fair thing to fall into that bucket. And obviously, we have heard testimony on varying levels of rigor in application of this test, right? So it's ultimately up to BEPC as to how they apply this. But the piece I would direct you to is, you pointed out, well, think about the effects on the development itself. What happens if you don't, right, maybe not be able to meet public safety standards? I would point to these specific considerations that BEPC has to undertake. So some of these obvious, it might take longer. It might cost more if you didn't have the tax increment financing because you would have to do it over a longer period. But more to your point, how the proposed housing development components and size would differ, if at all, including if applicable to that development, in the number of units of mixed income housing without the increments. So this is in part getting at, does the scope of the project, does the scope of the housing change because of the infrastructure, because of the lack of the increments? So it's holistic. It's not just looking at the infrastructure. It is looking at the housing, the effects on the housing development as well, which would go to your.
Does that mean, again, what if I propose 30 housing units? And I'm the developer or the town, it doesn't matter, the sponsor, whatever. And I propose a housing project with 30 units. And without, and it works
Mhm.
with the increment, but without the increment, I can only afford a smaller whatever and so I wouldn't be able to build 30, I'd be able to build 20. Is that what this is referring to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a thing that is considered in this process. I think I'm not going to have the greatest, like the best answers are going to come from BEPC
Yeah.
on this, right? But I think it is correct. That is the sort of thing it's trying to get at when it's saying, or would have occurred in a significantly different and less desirable manner. And if you think about the purpose of the chapters being generating housing, and you're talking about a reduction in 33%, the housing that you provide, that sounds significantly different. But it would be ultimately
To Pepsi.
Yep.
Can I ask another question? Did the Senate version have a but-for?
Did not. The first place at which the but-for test enters was in Ways and Means.
Is that but-for test the same as is currently in TIF,
It is.
word for word?
Yeah, I might have like a definition, like housing development site, right? But it is exactly the same with the limited changes I could make for these definitions. And when we get to the rulemaking section at the end, I'll talk a little bit about this, but there's a part of the broad authorization to BEPC for rulemaking includes a set of specific directives, things like building out a prioritization process, what floor areas should be used. Something that's been added here is to supplement the but-for test, giving consideration to any rulemaking that BEPC has already done for the but-for test that's on the books for TIF districts. So try to build out in rule ways of making this housing specific or making it easier for folks. But I would note that the rule can't contradict the statute, right? You have the test here, and BEPC would have the authority to supplement it, but they wouldn't be able to contradict it.
Did you have any other questions about this
Sure,
section?
no.
Yeah, but I mean about this section before he goes on.
No.
So the next, we talked about the removal of the location criteria. The next piece I'm going to hit is on page 11, subsection G. This is not entirely new, but there are a few new pieces of this, and it has been reorganized to fall at the end of the section because it's the municipality going through the hoops and then approval being granted. So seemed logically to make more sense at the end. Betsy shall approve or deny an application submitted pursuant to the section not later than 45 days following receipt of a completed application. So that deadline is new. We didn't previously have a deadline for Betsy approval. And these pieces are largely consistent with what you've seen before, but the change here is for the final application date. In the Ways and Means initial proposal, this was December 31, 2030. It's been pushed back a year. So your final CHIP application date is December 31, 2031.
I just want to, John, again, for clarifications on the, because frankly, I've been pushing for a limitation on the amount of time that Betsy has to approve this. The first time that I pushed for this, I'm saying a number of us pushed for this, was back when there was this separate board and we wanted to limit the time.
Mhm.
We wanted the board to meet contemporaneously with Betsy.
Yep.
And then what happened at the last minute, I was told that, well, it turns out there's no.
All right, well, let's, Mike, come on, let's get out of here so they can get out of here.
We can hear you.
Oh, sorry.
But welcome. I'm glad you're here, Saudia. Can you hear?
Can we stay?
Yeah, she just muted herself, so. we can hear
Okay,
her back.
good. All right.
And sorry.
But
No worries.
you're good. You can hear us?
Oh, she can.
Yes,
Okay.
I'm trying to log off my other phone. I was listening to the Zoom.
Okay, great. So there was originally, am I right?
Yes.
There was no deadline of any sort.
The piece that you're talking about, when the earlier board proposal had been included, there was a deadline for the board to respond in response to Betsy's recommendation. The reason you couldn't do it contemporaneously is that the board was only kicked on to make a determination once they had received a recommendation from Betsy, so they couldn't have been.
And originally, the board, as we had passed it, had quite literally one purpose and
Yes.
one purpose alone to
Right.
say, even if you don't match this percentage of housing within your project, we can say yes or no.
Plus, we tried to insert, we tried that they had to determine whether it was consistent with 1907, the purpose clause.
Yes.
But somehow, I'm not sure that made it into our amendment.
It's there, at least when I was looking this morning.
Okay.
Although I've looked at many things this morning, so who knows? But yes, the board concepts are quite different.
But there-
It was a sole decision in the House General Proposal related to an alternative to the floor area threshold.
Okay.
And it became a checking function in.
It became expanded.
Yep.
But there never was a limitation on Betsy's
Correct.
process.
Correct. This is
Okay.
the first that.
Now there is.
Yep.
Okay,
The next piece here is related to the limit. You guys have seen the $40 million limit before. So the addition that you're really seeing here, and we're on the bottom of page 11, Betsy may increase the limit by not more than 5 million upon application by the governor to and approval of the Joint Fiscal Committee. In evaluating the governor's request, JFC shall consider, economic and fiscal conditions of the state, including recent revenue forecasts and budget projections. Betsy is to provide testimony, documentation, application data, and any other information as requested to demonstrate that increasing the cap will create an opportunity for the creation of additional housing to meet the needs of a muni or munis and the state. This language is not novel. This same concept is included for the veggie program. So you can have a yearly increase to the cap under that program. Same concept here. You could get a yearly increase if Betsy came, applied, the governor applied and JFC approved that amount.
is there any, the cap is very controversial, so I want to make sure that we, I don't know, stir the pot here and do we have everything? Questions? Yes.
Oh, I was just gonna start the pot.
I was
You
going like
asked me
this.
to.
Yeah, okay, well, we will, but while John's here, are there questions? I have a question, but are there any questions?
On something on this?
Yeah, on this. The $5 million addition. I'm not familiar with the way it worked before, but this is something. This is something that can be done annually?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so it's not a one-time thing.
This could be done annually, but it is a reset, right? It's not like you would go 40 to 45 and the next year you would go 45 to
Right, it's
50.
every year.
It'd be each year you're subject to a 40 mil cap and then you can get a 5 mil increase.
Is there anything to stop the governor from doing it twice in 1 year?
Uh,
I don't think that would happen. I don't think we'd be pushed to raise the cap, but is there?
I read it as you
Not more
can't
than-
increase by not more than 5 million and it's tied to the annuals. I don't think that you can, but in any event, there'd be a JFC check on that, right?
Okay. So it's a once a year, you think,
Exactly,
ability up to 5 million. All right,
exactly. So you could get to 45 mil. Yeah.
okay.
And just to confirm, I think you guys know, but this is aggregate lifetime education property tax increment retention, meaning that across the lifetime of all projects applied in that year, how much they could retain in education property tax.
So the lifetime is the lifetime. It's the amount of increment the project is going to take each year
Process
to pay off its bonds across the life of the project, which means the life of the bond.
And the retention period is 20 years, right? So effectively, it's going to be a 20-year timeline for.
Right, yeah, okay,
But,
yes,
so you said the project, but you mean all the projects throughout the
yeah,
state?
no, yeah, yes, in other words, for each, but the lifetime refers to the project. So if I'm Vepsi, every time I would do an approval, John, correct me. Every time I would do an approval, I would have to know how much over the life of that project for 20 years, which is the time, the bond duration. I would have to know how much that's going to consume in payments every year to pay off the bond. That's the amount, and then I would stick it in the ledger. And when that amount gets to 40 million
New
for the
projects.
year, I can't approve another project unless it's extended.
Right, so that is principal and interest
Yeah.
essentially, the total cost of the bond.
Right, right.
To be clear, though, your debt costs could exceed the increment that you have available. And what would be the cap here wouldn't be, like, let's say you found other financing streams to supplement this with, right? And so your debt costs were quite high and they would total some enormous sum. The count here is against the education property tax retention. So it wouldn't be that you're not counting the debt, you're counting the retention. You're counting what the impact to the ed fund is.
So in other words, under CHIP, I can issue one bond issue using tax increment financing. You're saying, hey, if I borrow money some other way,
Yeah, that's different.
that's different. It's not subject to the cap.
Exactly, the cap doesn't apply to,
Right.
right, it's just about what it's
Get
saying.
tax increment financing, if I want to
Exactly.
go borrow money from a bank, which I probably would, debt, that's not.
And if you think about in a particular year, right, that your increment could be insufficient, it wouldn't make sense to count the things that you can't cover. Like, that's not impacting the ed fund.
Yeah.
Those things, right?
Yes,
So just, I'm trying to
yeah,
put it in context, project in Burlington.
yeah. it's cool.
Hula.
Yeah.
Is infrastructure is 17 million.
Mhm.
Yeah,
So we would be, if they were to use CHIP, the 17 million
would apply against.
would apply and whatever. Would it be 17 million or would it be 17 million plus whatever interest they're gonna wind up paying over the 20 years?
What it would
If
be,
they're taking the 17 from CHIP,
so I'm understanding you to say 17 million is the cost of what they're financing.
right?
What you would have a cap on is the amount of increment that is provided to cover the cost of financing. Know that you're going to have a municipal increment as well. So it's not going to be the full 17 million, right? And then you're only going to have a particular percentage of the increment that's retained, and you may have other streams. So it's not the 17 million. It would be lower than that.
Okay.
But I don't know what that figure would be, but it would be whatever increment you're retaining.
From the ed fund specifically.
Exactly.
not-
Exactly. And it's not the municipal. The cap doesn't apply to the municipal increment.
I have
It's a
asked,
lifetime, but what makes it lifetime?
It's just across
it's the
the-
repayment.
Yeah, I mean, that's a way to think about it.
What we're totaling is the total amount of the repayments that go back into the education fund is.
when he says retain, he means.
He actually means not
He
given to the
means
ed
stand
fund.
out of the ed fund, yeah.
Yes. What makes it a lifetime though? I did this is why I don't.
Lifetime is across the the full, so you have a retention period for each project, right? That 20-year
Yeah.
period. Lifetime is a way of calling out, this isn't a cap on what you're doing in a year, right? They could just look at the application
Oh, great.
Oh, come on.
and,
It was just a flutter.
if you didn't have a lifetime cap, right, it could be read to mean that what you're capping is in a year, that much impact on the ed fund, right? But what it's saying is across the course, the full 20 years of retention. Let's say in the first year you retain 2 million, in the second year you retain 2.1 million. You add up each of those 20 years to get your lifetime increment retained.
In other words, is it true? It's all tied to the idea of a bond issue. To support the infrastructure for a project, you got to issue a bond. It's
Right.
usually a 20-year bond. And so that means you're going to be spending interest, making interest payments on that bond, interest and principal payments for 20 years. You add those up, and that's the amount that counts against the 40 million for that year. So what I am told is that if VEPSI were to go for the whole 1,400 units at once, it would, for example, it would consume 17 million of the 40 for that year. That would be 1,400 units. What I am told by the ULA people is they would never do that. They'll do it phase by phase. But that's just an example.
Okay.
Yes.
So
Working on
okay. I'll wait. I'll keep my comments to myself.
Okay, go ahead.
Sure. The next thing is just a technical change. This is nothing too big, but we're in the indebtedness section on page 12. This is non-substantive. But when we talk about when a housing development site terminates, so this is very technical, can terminate in two instances. One is when your debt retires, that means it's over, right? So you no longer have a designated area. There's no OTB, it's just over. The project doesn't exist anymore. So when debt retires, housing development site can terminate. The other way is if you failed to incur debt within your debt incursion period. If you didn't meet the debt incursion period limits, which is what you see in subsection A here, and what you can see is that you have 5 years from creation to incur debt, right? And you may get an extension of 3 years. But if you failed within that extended period or just the 5 years, if you didn't get an extension, the housing development site would terminate. Previously, we split the description of that termination across 2 subsections. And now we've just condensed it to be in this subsection on page 13. I think it's just much clearer. The housing development site shall continue until the date now the indebtedness is retired, or if no debt is incurred, the debt incursion period ends. So not a substantive change. It's just cleaner than it was before. The next pieces relate to rulemaking, which is a good bit further down. So I'm going to pause my screen share until I get to it. All the way at the bottom of page 21. And there are 2 changes that you're going to see here. So as I noted before, VEPSI has broad authority to adopt rules to implement this subchapter, but it also has specific directives. So there are 3 things it has to do. It can do other things, but it must specifically do these. It has to develop a process for governing the prioritization of applications submitted for approval. And previously, this included a consideration of blight. That has been removed and replaced with vacancy or dilapidation to address the political sensitivity concerns. The second change here is the addition of this subdivision 3. And I talked about this earlier when we were talking about the but-for test. But the rulemaking here is to supplement the but-for test, giving due consideration to any rulemaking for the supplement but-for test under Title 32. So if VEPSI has undertaken rulemaking to build out how they undertake that but-for test, they can build out the but-for test here, and they should consider what they have done in the district's context. And it could be things like making this housing specific, right? Having elements that you look to related to sort of the concerns you were describing earlier. The next changes are with the removal of the board, which is something you're not going to see here. I talked about how there was still an appetite to have housing expertise touch these CHIP applications. And so what you're seeing in section 26 is in addition to what we already had before, which is just amending the authorizing language, we have an update to the membership of VEPSI's board. So this is on page 24. And what you see at the very bottom that in addition to Betsy's existing membership, we have added exclusively for purposes of reviewing and approving housing infrastructure project applications under CHIP. The council shall additionally have 2 voting members, the executive director of VHFA and the executive director of VHCB or designee in either case, and as a non-voting member, commissioner of DHCD. So you would have some housing expertise available on this VEPSI board, and I would just note exclusively for the CHIP program, so things like veggie and the like are not flowing through this membership. But this was the solution they were proposing to, this is the response, I think, in part to removing the board. The very last piece is, we're looking in section 27. And so we're outside of the scope of the CHIP program now. We're looking at existing law. This is existing law on TIP districts. Exactly. And what you're seeing on the very end, on page 27, is the sunset, which is the final application date. The Ways and Means proposal had this end. There was initially a proposal to end simultaneously with the rollout of CHIP. And then I think it was pushed back to 2028. And now what you see here is Betsy shall only approve under the section applications for tax increment financing submitted prior to December 31, 2031. So aligning the final application deadline for TIP districts with the final application deadline for CHIP. And the way that it has been articulated is that it forces a holistic look at both programs at the same time. But that is the full of the changes in this amendment. I'm happy to try to answer questions.
I just have a process question for you. The Rural Caucus is offering an amendment. It turns out they're offering it today, not tomorrow. So we need to walk through that and also do a straw poll on that. We'll do a straw poll on this amendment and we'll do a straw poll on that amendment. Do you know who will be walking us through that amendment?
I do not, but if you have it, right
It
now.
was just sent
It was just.
from Nigel to our inboxes.
Okay, so if it's public, I can walk you very quickly through what it does. That's not hard for me to do.
I believe we leave Rep. Sibilia, but I can.
Yeah, I would imagine she's the, yeah.
Okay. And you are now about to turn into a pumpkin, correct?
Yes, but if you need that, it's pretty quick to walk through it. It's not hard to explain, but
I actually have questions.
Go
that I
ahead,
would
please.
appreciate answered. Can we talk about in perpetuity, please, for a second?
yes. We're talking about primary residence piece.
Yeah, I think so. I can't remember what page it's on.
That would be 7, I think, unless you're talking about affordable.
Let me just. So. I don't. Like the in perpetuity and. Both
And either, yeah.
either. But when I had asked somebody about it, it was explained to me that it just had to be offered.
That's correct. The restriction is on offering, right? Provide terms and sufficient remedies or an ordinance to ensure that any housing unit be offered exclusively as a bona fide domicile in perpetuity.
I don't like in perpetuity. I don't like this language. I think it's really gross and sneaky. Personally, I think if we want something, we need to stand on our values and our morals. And if it's something we really believe in, I think we need to say what we have to say. And I think this is sneaky. And that.
I still can't find the.
Page 7.
Okay,
And it's on line 17 through 19.
oh, thank
So
you.
it says
So I turn.
be offered. So as long as somebody offers it, but then somebody comes back and says, well, I'm actually gonna make it my second home. Or whatever.
But it is a bit stronger than that. So it's offered exclusively as a bona fide domicile. So if they get the response, I'm not using it for the second home, they aren't selling to that person.
Yeah, it-
But what this really is, the difference I would draw here between something that is more substantive is that this doesn't ask for a continual enforcement mechanism of folks going out and investigating. This is just a check at the point of offering, right? And so you are going to be reliant on the assertions of the buying party, but I think that's always going to be.
So you think that let's say I buy, she's selling a house. She's the builder. She builds it, she sells it to me. It has to be sold to me for only my own domicile. If I turn around, I buy it, I say, okay, and I don't, let's say I don't violate that, I just don't. But then I sell it to a second party 3 years later because I'm moving. I don't have to offer it.
You do have to offer it because the requirement is for the offer in perpetuity to
Right.
be exclusively.
Right, that's what I thought. So
Yeah.
what that means is, as a practical matter, there would just be a deed restriction that would run with the land. Right?
I think that is what, I mean, this is agnostic as to how you achieve it, but that's the
probably
idea.
how you achieve it, right?
I frankly, it's outside the scope of what I, yeah.
That's what my understanding is with those kinds of things, they're deed restricted. Like any other covenant in a, subdivision that you covenant. to-
Right, like, oh, you can't
Your house.
use this STR. You
Yeah,
can't-
right, yeah,
But that makes me feel a little better. I still don't like the in perpetuity.
right, but yeah,
Is this, like, yeah, my concern, and I think, Tom really laid out how commonly it can happen that there's like a sham sale, and so this would be addressing that, but we're not telling the towns or the agents or anybody, the sellers, the buyers, how this is gonna be regulated, but it would give us a leg to stand on, or it would give somebody a leg to
It gets
stand
done.
on.
It does
Should
get,
somebody decide this is not right, this was supposed to be state funded for primary housing.
yep, and I would point to the language that was actually added in here, which is the terms and sufficient remedies. So there's going to be measures in place to.
Somebody doing a title search before
We see it right
real estate.
away, yeah.
Yeah. I think this is good.
I mean, what, this came up, everybody, do you remember when the league was here? They were worried
Yeah,
about
they were worried
this.
about their
but this-
obligations.
About the obligation, and we said, okay, and then other committees didn't. And this says, and what I've learned since then, I think the league was worried about complicated enforcement
Yeah.
issues. I mean, I think it won't be enforced by the city, the town, it'll be enforced by the banks, the lenders, et cetera.
And domicile is easier to.
Yeah, we prefer domicile, yeah.
Can I
Yes,
ask one last question?
please.
The prioritization language for Betsy,
We're talking about the rulemaking section.
yeah. I think I'm getting caught on the word prioritization. Because when I think of that, I'm thinking of you have several options in front of you. You'd have several applications in front of you.
Mhm.
And I guess I'm concerned with having that 45-day deadline. I mean, again, originally, this intent of this change is just changing the intent and the simplicity of the original CHIP language. But I'm concerned with using the language prioritization because you're gonna have multiple applications in front of you. Would Betsy then have to approve in groups?
That's a really interesting question. I have not thought about the interaction of prioritization and the deadline, which is, I think,
Because I'd be concerned if they have to wait for a group to come in, all be ready, because what if only one application
So-
comes in?
yeah. So part of what will remain to be seen is if you get anywhere near the cap. If you get nowhere near the cap, then the prioritization just doesn't even matter, right? You could just
We just.
approve every project that comes through. So this is trying to be sensitive to the fact that there is a cap, and it's asking them to develop a process, right, to govern those prioritization. But I don't know what they will settle on as to how they do their process. I think that would be a fair thing to ask how that's going to be.
But I think I think as a practical, I know you've got to go. As a practical matter, first of all, they have to address prioritization when they do their regs. So presumably by the time they open it up for applications, they have thought through what their prioritization is in their reg. So that the problem comes when, let's say, their prioritization has a lot of geographic diversity in it. And they don't want things about programs that use a small amount of income not foreclosing programs that have a smaller amount of increment consumed. for just one big project, it consumes a lot of, whatever they say. The problem always is with prioritization is the 1-year signal. And I don't think it's the 45-day limit. It's just intrinsic, which is a reluctance to hold on and not do something. They would literally have to deny a project or hold a project until they got more application, which they would have the authority to do. But it's difficult to administer, I think, always. Some testimony I heard, I think, referred to this problem in terms of giving money away during COVID. That essentially it was hard people just wanted to get the money out the door.
Right.
Yeah, so there's always going to be that. I think honestly, there's always going to be some of that. Any other questions of
For
John
John.
before he has to
If
go?
it's necessarily for John, it's just.
Okay, we will have discussion now. We have time.
John? Good luck.
Good luck and thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
This was calm compared to what you were about to
Right,
walk
right.
into.
Yes.
I kind of want to watch.
I know, I don't like tension or things, but I was like, I wouldn't want to miss out.
Yeah.
See you guys through.
Okay, John.
Out through your mouth.
John, are you booked for the rest of the morning, do you think, with it?
Yeah, I'll be out the,
Yeah, okay, all
It's
right.
gonna be a,
Yeah.
they may be on the floor all day, I don't know.
right,
Okay. Okay, so I think now is the time for people to comment on their thoughts about this.
On the
And questions
amendment.
on the amendment, yeah, and as it amends the Ways and Means Amendment, yes.
I have
Tom,
a question about Pepsi and their rulemaking.
yeah,
Who approves their rulemaking that they?
Elcar, I think. You know what
And
Elcar is?
that
Yeah.
there are rulemaking committee thing, you explained to me.
Legislative Committee on Administrative Ruling,
Okay,
our shadow government.
so the drama that's playing out with conflicting interests with regard to everything from land use to education funds and everything else plays out again and I'm uneasy deferring so much discretion to Pepsi and to a smaller group, because all of these things, the rural caucus, environment, the Ways and Means, everybody has all of these priorities that Pepsi doesn't need to take into consideration, and neither does the rulemaking committee. So these are the things that are driving all of this discussion and all of these amendments and everything else. Should we yield that discretion when that is those questions exactly that are driving the shape of the bill? And I don't have anything personal against Pepsi. I have no history with them. I don't know who they are. But I'm concerned that we're putting a lot of discussion into weighing all of these different concerns and then kind of releasing them to the wild. So is that just the way it goes, or?
Please go ahead.
do we?
The actual purpose of LCAR is to ensure that any rule, theoretically, to ensure that any rules that are created are in the spirit in which the original legislation was intended.
Okay. So is there enough of the original intention expressed to keep that relatively binding, or at least relatively obvious when they do? Like we put the rural,
We've put
the language about the rural communities and the purpose.
and geographic diversity. Those are the two things that we have put in.
And Alcar would be
And I
looking,
think it has to go
they're
through.
assessing rules.
But, and that's Elcar's function. And I sat next to Representative Squirrel, who's the chair of Elcar, when I was in approps, and listened to him regale me with the length of their hearings and the testimony they received, and they have disapproved regulation, or rejected them. Then what usually happens is the agency modifies them. The agency isn't required to modify them, and there have been occasions of standoff
Yep.
In which case, by law, the burden of proving, do you need to talk to me? Yeah, the burden of proof switches from, one kick over, switches from one, from the plaintiff or the challenger to the agency to, they have the burden of proof to defend their regulation. But that doesn't happen very often.
An example is nothing to do with any of this, but this education worked for a number of years on new education quality standards that they then had to run through LCAR. And there was about a year-long conflict between the two about the education quality standards.
These are all public meeting, open meeting, YouTube.
Excuse
I
me.
have never been able to find.
So what we're gonna do, okay,
Yeah,
they're live
or I would
stream.
have.
Are they live stream?
What's going on?
Continue chatting.
Nice amended amendment.
Was your an answer?
I think so, because I am looking at the fact that when Betsy does make a ruling on an application, that it's not subject to review. So I want to make sure that, I just want to confidence level that the rules they do come up with are kind of what everybody's sort of picturing here. And it sounds like that's exactly the question that Elkhart is there to.
Theoretically,
The fact that when Betsy does make a ruling on an application.
Sorry.
theoretically, it should be the same legislature that passed the bill in the first place that approves the rules.
Okay.
So that there's a tie between those legislators on our and the
Okay.
spirit of the bill. Theoretically.
Hi, can I chime in real quick? Speaking of the board and all those, well, not the board, but Pepsi, the membership. Because this is an interesting conversation and I'm just trying to clarify if it's the same, if it's a appointed legislature, how long do people serve on Pepsi? Because it's one appointed member from the House and from the Senate. And so what does that term look like for Pepsi? Does that role and that person get swapped out, that membership, for like current legislature? I'm curious about that. I just dawned on me through listening to this conversation. Did that make sense?
Yeah, so the others in the room who've been here longer than I have, who can answer that, because I don't actually know how long the terms are. But specifically for this amendment, there will only be 3 members of VEPSI who are able to make decisions on CHIP. And they will not be regular voting members of VEPSI. They will not be able to talk about veggie or any other program. They're just going to be on for CHIP. And that's going to be,
And there's 2 voting and 1
Yeah.
non-voting.
yeah, so the not voting would be DHCD and then VHFA
And
and
VHCB are
VHCB would be
the
the 2 voting.
voting.
Because I think DHCD already has a voting spot in the.
But they can't, yeah, but they cannot
Then you
make
can
a
extra.
vote on this. Does that help, Brett Lamont?
Well, no, not really. Because I have another question about conflict of interest, and I know this sounds terrible, but I'm getting into the nuance of would it in fact not be one of those organizational structures that would be responsible to be the designated partnership in said infrastructure investment? If it was to be what I'm confused on where the lines get towed between who gets to vote and then who was then impacted. Like, does that, I don't know, maybe I'm misreading it.
No, I completely understand what you're asking, and let me ask it a different way, and then you can say if I'm understanding what you're saying.
Thank you.
So in that membership of the 3 individuals, there is obviously a proponent of affordable housing agencies. And would there be a vote or would there be more approvals to, because even though a developer can say, I'm not going to do an affordable housing program or project, I'm only gonna take 60% of the increment. But if there's another one that is saying, but another developer comes in saying they are doing affordable housing and they're gonna get more of the increment, is there going to be a conflict of interest where the vote is always gonna go with the affordable housing project, when we know that we need housing of all kinds?
Sort of. I'm just saying the voting members are of the agencies that would be leading those projects. And so that is what I'm referring to, because it would in turn be their own interest because they would be the partner. Or is there a clause in there that says when they're voting on things, it is not for a project that they are going to be managing or funding or things like that? Do you see what I'm saying?
There is no clause, and I think that is a great question.
It's sort of like,
So
you know how we
I-
can't put, like, we can't vote on things that directly impact us. You know what I'm saying?
So, yeah, for us, the conflict of interest is if we're gonna directly be impacted financially by the, yeah. I would just say that with the way I'm reading from page 24 to 25, the membership of the Pepsi Council. So there's 11 voting members generally, and those include a lot of different types of members. And then for CHIP decisions, it would be these 2 more voting members and then another non-voting member that we're outlining. To me, it seems fair because we are trying to promote affordable housing for low and moderate income. It makes sense in that you already have the, if you have this maximum that you can approve, I, as a voting member, if I imagine a voting member sitting there trying to make the most out of the CHIP infrastructure funding, I would be weighing, like, how much money do we have total that we're allowed to take out of the ed fund or not go into the ed fund or whatever. And if it's, if a for-profit developer is trying to develop in a region that doesn't have a lot of other housing development happening and that needs it, and their increment is going to be less, so more goes to the ed fund, then that's also a strong candidate, in my opinion. So, I mean, I don't think that it automatically is going to stack it against those
No,
projects.
I'm good. I just wanted to have the conversation.
Well,
Just
I
to
can,
tease
I appreciate
it out.
that.
You know what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
no,
I just want to make sure we're teasing out the nuance of it all.
you know what I think it comes down to? It's a big problem all the time in Vermont. It's weighing conflict against connection and knowledge. Something we always are doing, I think that the idea was that it would, Betsy, not officially, there may be people who filled positions on Betsy who know something about housing, but there certainly was nobody there who's literally named as being housing experts. And we thought, they've got to have the benefit of that. I do think as a practical matter, I don't think any developer is going to undertake to try to go for the 80% unless they get into a partnership, and it won't be with one of those 3. It'll be with one of the nonprofits like the Champlain Housing Trust or Evernorth or something like that, because that they administer this stuff. So I don't know that they would be directly conflicted, Saudia, that way. It's conceivable. I guess my feeling is, there's a risk, but it's outweighed by their knowledge that they're bringing to the table.
That's fair. I just, like I said, I just wanted to tease it out. So make sure we're actually just making sure we're and being really intentional about what is happening here and that it's discussed so that we're there's a clear understanding.
Other thoughts? I mean, I missed a little, but are there other thoughts? Oh, by the way, I'm sorry. What I was out there was trying to figure out the order of who's hearing what when. And Laura Sibilia will be walking us through the World Caucus Amendment at noon. Sorry, everybody, but noon, because she's in Ways and Means at 11 and she's in, or before that, I guess, and she's in over there at 11:30, and then she's here at noon. So we might be a little hungry on the floor, maybe make us nastier, or I think we should move to a straw poll when we're done with discussion, and if we're there, we could take a break before noon and get some lunch. Yes.
I would like to, page 7, I'd like to understand the perpetuity a little bit better.
Yeah, okay.
Is it similar to when Champlain Housing
Yeah.
Trust?
Well,
It follows,
there's two perpetuities in this bill, in this amendment. One applies to the requirement for affordable housing, that has to be in perpetuity. And as I said, I think that will be done. I think any developer would do that in partnership with one of these nonprofits, because it involves, if it's rental, it involves kind of administrating of the rental units, so they're always rented to people who are income qualified. Most developers who develop housing don't want to get into that business. They want to just have, one of these agencies, one of these nonprofits do it for them. If it's purchase homes for purchase, right? And then usually the way it works is, as you've heard, are these programs of shared equity.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and again, those are really administered, there's entities around the state who know how to administer those, and you do that. The other perpetuity, which is the one that our vice chair was talking about, is the whole issue of ensuring that the residences that are offered, whose infrastructure, the residences that are served by the infrastructure in this program are residences that are permanently residences and not short-term rentals.
Can I ask a question?
And that is probably, it doesn't say how that would happen. It would probably just be deed restriction. Yes.
So if we remember that in the Homes Act, S-100, we made ADUs much more accessible.
Yeah.
So say I'm sold one of these houses, it is my primary residence, but I want to build an
ADU.
Yeah, what happens?
That's a really interesting question. I'll tell you what my belief is. My belief is you could build it and rent it out, but if you
I'm
propose,
living there.
as long as, yes.
Or-
As long as it's, but the ADU, I think what you'd have to do, let me say what you couldn't do. I don't think you could say to your town, I want to build an ADU and use it for short-term rentals. I think you'd have to say, I'm doing it as a rental. It's going to be, I'm going to be a normal landlord and rent it for, 1 year at a time. I think as a practical matter, this is completely different than the law. As a practical matter, what happens is things become short-term rentals and they're fine unless somebody complains.
Well, then, but I guess, but more to the point, the state money
Is
is
already
going to the infrastructure for the first initial house.
Right.
And then what the person does on that property, if they
Good
build an
point.
ADU, they
Yeah.
will have to pay for their own infrastructure to extend.
Well, it won't,
That's
wouldn't even
not what I'm
take it.
talking about. This is in perpetuity.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah,
doesn't
that's
matter,
what it
the
says.
infrastructure's already there.
Yeah.
It's not about payment.
Right.
But I think it's the units that were supported at the time by that infrastructure. If someone comes in and then wants an ADU.
It's not additional additional.
Actually, you know what, at this point, I'm just guessing. My guess is the most that would happen is the ADU. You wouldn't be told, no, you can't do it in an ADU. You might be told the ADU has to be a real rental. It can't be short-term rental. That would be the most that would happen. If if Nora's right, maybe you wouldn't be told anything. I just don't know.
But this is a good question. So how do we get the answer for that?
I don't think there is an answer on the statute. I think it's one of those things that the VEPC rules would have to refine.
I'd be interested to see what kind of testimony Ways and Means took on it.
If any.
We didn't.
I think that was her point.
Yes,
Another, wondering what their testimony was the 60% if you don't meet that.
60,
Yeah.
60. Was it 60 or 65?
60% of the education property tax for projects that don't satisfy the mixed income.
What page, Chuck?
Right,
Yeah.
so when we were trying to create the incentive for lower and middle income housing.
By removing.
And so they lowered
I see what they did. I'm just curious if they understood that
Yeah.
60%.
Yeah, I thought the
60%,
Champlain housing-
like the entire point of this is to make projects pencil out, right?
yeah,
And if we're using 70, would hope that number came about during the process when they actually reined in.
no, because that was just
Tip.
the TIF number, yeah.
You're
I mean,
thinking about, floor.
Floor area ratio,
Yeah.
what is this? Oh, 60%.
I would think, I would hope anyway,
Yeah.
Yeah,
that
yeah, right.
during the TIF.
Yeah.
Reining it in and putting
Yeah,
some
what-
guardrails around it, that they came to that 70 for a reason.
Yeah.
Like, once you start going below 70, those projects start not penciling out anymore.
Right.
So I'd be curious to know where 60 came from. I'm perfectly fine with saying like, hey, let's do a little more, let's do 80 for if you do meet that. But do they actually start not penciling out at 60? Are we kind of killing half of the point of this bill?
You're asking a really good question. It's one I asked as well.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what I heard.
Some areas don't need
Yeah, I
affordable
know.
housing anymore. They just need housing.
I think that I asked, was there any testimony to support the 60%? Because 60% is new. In other words, the current
Yeah.
is 70%. And the answer is yes, we received testimony to say that. I asked Build Homes, where they were on that, and they're okay with it.
Well, I'm glad they're okay with it, because I'm not.
But, okay, well, I think that's a perfectly reasonable policy position. That what you're saying, Joe, is it should have been, you're okay with the incentive, but you would have preferred 70, 90 or something.
70,
like that.
80
You're
is fine.
70, 80. Well, that's where we were, yeah.
That's where we were.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we were 70, 80, and they went to 60, 80 to increase the percentage. And I asked whether there was testimony to support the lower number. I got the answer, yes, and I've heard it from Let's Build Homes, but that's all I know.
Well, Let's Build Homes testified
Yeah.
that
Yeah, or have stated that, yes.
they're okay with it.
Yeah, and they support this amendment.
I think my understanding is they just want to get it to conference. They know that this is not what it needs to be to actually be beneficial for our state. But that's not gonna happen in our body, so
I
they
love,
want to see it go to conference, is my understanding.
Other thoughts from members before we take trouble? I guess, go ahead.
Is this about the amendment before we straw poll?
Yes, yes.
Well. I did see an email. I think it went to legislators from Let's Build Homes. Which made me feel better a bit. I will be supporting the amendment. Because I have spent enough time here knowing that compromise, even some, isn't still always what you want. But I'm not gonna, in this case, let my vote have the perfect be the enemy of the good. I'm really proud of the bill that we worked on. And, you know, we'll be supporting that bill as well later today. Takes a lot of committees sometimes to work on things, and I haven't always agreed with everything that's come back. I also have great desires to see this go to conference, and I'd rather have that be what happens than have it fail. And I think I've been vocal. I did not support the first amendment that came through. But I will be voting to support this amendment today. And I also plan to hopefully be around building for a while, and we'll revisit, if it passes this way, we'll revisit things in the future. And you know, there are a lot of unknowns, and that policy wise does make sense. I'm always been committed to doing everything and anything to unlock tools for our housing crisis and supported the original language and intent. But as a legislator, I also understand that my voice isn't the only one, and I will again be supporting this today. And we'll be paying very close attention to how this shakes out in the future. And note that I haven't heard the last for me on this, and may need some adjustments as well.
I guess I owe you all my views since my name is on this.
Sure.
First of all, I want to tell you, I spent quite a bit of time last night and over the weekend preparing my floor report. Wait a minute. Saudia, before I go ahead, do you have something you want to add or say? Your
Yeah,
hand
no,
is up.
thank you. No, I mean, well, yeah, real quick. I just wanted to say, yeah, I mean, this is a challenge because I feel like our committee did really great work, and I was really proud of the bill that our committee passed out. And I feel like that was a great compromise. I feel like that a lot of due diligence went into that. And with the working and going through cross committees, and I feel like it was really solid. And then this is definitely a step in the right direction from the Ways and Means Amendment. Still not where we need to be. And so, I mean, as much as I don't want to support it, I will so that it can go to conference. But I'm doing that in good faith that in conference committee, it will not be made worse. Like Vermont, like that we hear our constituents, that we hear the need of what is happening in the reality, and that we don't go 2 steps back in the opposite direction. And also in good faith that we have another year. And so like, let's get the ball rolling with a housing bill this year. And we're going to, and the conversation continues. Right. So I didn't want to cut you off, Chair. Thank you for your work on this. It like I said, it is a step in the right direction. So I appreciate your negotiations with the other parties on this and trying to get it closer to where it needs to be. So thank you for that. But I think we still have work to be done. But thank you for your work. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So what I was saying is I've been spending a lot of time doing my floor report, which you're all going to have to sit through. And what it's made me do is go back over everything that was in our bill, you know, besides chips. But I mean, I also summarized chips. And I think we accomplished a lot. I really do.
Do we have to take a straw poll?
What we're going to do, Rockwell, and I think that we accomplished a lot. We really, I admire all of you. I admire the work that we did to make this work. And I even think that the CHIPS language that we came out with was better even than it came out before. I do understand. I have come to understand very much. I have come to understand where Ways and Means comes from when they address these issues. They really do see themselves as kind of the guardians of the property taxpayer. And I think that's, I have to admit, a legitimate perspective. Sure, there's part of me that feels like, wait a minute, housing is an emergency. You know, we have to deal with this emergency. So that's where the pressure came from in trying to craft this. In the past, I mean, historically, no bill involving tax increment has ever gotten this far. It's true. It's just never gotten this far. It dies in Ways and Means. I think, rightly or wrong, it just does. And I think that my view is, having sat in the room with these people, that this amendment is as far as we're going to go now before conference. I think I do want to add, I actually, for what it's worth to people, like what's in here. And here's why. We had a role for the board. You know what I mean? The board, that extra board,
The chip board.
the chip board. We had it in our bill. And the more I listened to people who were worried about making this unduly complicated, the more I almost kind of regretted that. And so when we finally got them to just take it out, I think that's actually better than our bill. And I like the idea of adding the housing people in, because that brings expertise to VEPC. And I'm not that experienced with VEPC. I think we're going to have to get more into it. I don't think we're going to be able to sort of just do what we do and then forget it. I think we're going to have to find out, like within a year, how is this functioning? What do the rules look like? We may have to get a copy of the VEPC proposed rules and testify. I mean, you know, that's not impossible to do. Or testify before LCAR or whatever. I just don't think we're going to be able to let go of it, but I'm glad that we got rid of that. After having struggled with the whole thing about, well, what areas of the state are eligible, it was actually, I believe, Representative Sibilia who came with who was talking to us and said, why are you guys doing this? Well, this isn't a land use bill. And it was sort of like an aha moment went off. Here, I've been trying, you know, when we did our bill to amplify it, was getting into this tier 1, tier 2. And I realized this is a financing bill. If people can get their approvals, go for it. You know, in other words, don't. So I like that too. I think we had a list, remember, tier 1A, tier 1B, and then tier 2, if it was tier 1able and all that. I think this is better, actually better. It just says, forget it. It's not an issue. I also, the rural urban thing. You know, it's like you said, Tom, it's our big issue, really. And I guess my feeling is I have two thoughts on that. One, you already know, which is I said, we've got to have to stay on this. We have to have staying power, folks. We can't have even a one-term perspective. The second is, I think if we really, okay, this is my view. I don't think the problem is complexity or the size of the town. Even my little towns could do this because they just get the regional planning commission to do it for them. And or get help, you know, and the lawyers, that's all paid for out of the bonds. So that's not the problem. The problem is that a lot of projects are so damn small, they just don't generate enough increment to make it worthwhile to do. That's the problem. I mean, if the infrastructure is, if you need a big road and sewer, well, forget sewer, you need a big road to serve 20 houses, it just might not pencil out. You know, the increment isn't going to be there. So the real question in my mind isn't about that. It's about what can we do in this committee to help the really small projects. I think we've done one thing, the bond bank. The bond bank is out there just they know how to do that. They just shoot money into shoot money into it, into a project. Even if it's a project with 6 units, they can do that. There are other ways we could do it to help, and this is really important, but this is what I think. But we will never get those other ways through without Ways and Means. And so our relationship with Ways and Means is a relationship. It is not transactional. It isn't like, it's a relationship, and I take that into account. It is really important for us to understand and respect their kind of where they're coming from and why they're coming from that. And any solution that we come up with to really help small towns is going to have to get through them. And so it's just a fact that, and I take that into account. And it's been part of my animating, what animated me in pushing through on this amendment. I will say, and this again is just my view, I'm not particularly worried about the but-for test just because I don't think anybody is going to apply for this program or be seriously considered unless they can demonstrate that they need the money for the project. It's just so basic. They need the money for the project. If they don't need the money, it won't be approved. And in my mind, they have to show, they somehow are going to have to show with their pro forma or whatever, they're going to have to show that they can't pay for the infrastructure. That in order to make it commercially successful, consistent with the standards, they need the money. It's just so basic. And to me, that's the but-for test right there. But everybody hates the label and has gotten upset about it. I just want to say I'm not, because I think it would happen anyway. I think the cap, I only have one thing to add on the cap, or two. Maybe you'll think I've been spending too much time in the room with Ways and Means. You know how you get captured in hostage situations. You can maybe think I'm captured, right?
Is that the relationship?
Yeah, but
Sounds healthy.
yeah, but no, I've come to understand two things. One thing is, this is a new program. It's a 5-year new program, and they're saying, and I think they're right, don't do that and say to the taxpayers, sky's the limit. We're saying to the taxpayers, there's some upper limit here, and it's a check back, and if we should be so lucky, and I mean lucky, that we have enough applications for this new machine that we actually are getting towards the cap. It forces us to revisit it, and I don't think that's a bad thing. The other thing I would add is despite the fact that I think some sort of cap is necessary, I would be troubled if I felt the cap was really going to cramp this experiment. And I don't. And the reason is, I think we can build so many houses under this cap. I'm worried the opposite. I'm worried that the people aren't going to be lined up to use it, and that it won't work, and we'll have to revisit why not. But the administration gave Jeff Carr, who's their economist, they gave them this and asked Jeff in the last few days, how many houses do you think we could build infrastructure for under this? And he said 5,000. CHT says it varies, 4,000, 7,500. They gave an example of one that was a project they did where, given what they spent, they could do 7,500. I don't think anybody really knows for sure because the infrastructure could vary so much. The 7,500 was based on, I think, $45,000 in infrastructure per house. Pula is more like 50,000, 40,000 a house.
What period are they talking about?
The life of the project.
Okay.
over the life of the program. So
Okay.
I think we're talking about something like 4, 5, 6, 7,000 units. And I guess my feeling is that's okay. If we get anywhere, and that's without the governor being able to go in there every year and say, I want 10 million more.
Mhm.
But
5 million.
is it,
Right,
it's
yeah,
5 million, I'm
it's
sorry, yeah, 5 million. I think, are we going to exceed that? I hope so. I hope so, in which case we'll deal with it. But I worry, what I worry about is the contrary. I worry about that we've gone through all the work of creating this device and it's just, Lord help us, there aren't enough developers, not enough people swinging hammers, not enough, all the other stuff that it just won't, not that much will happen and we'll have to think harder about other things. So I'll be supporting it and that's why.
Little point about the cap.
Yeah.
What we're doing with CHIP is enabling construction of places that doesn't already have adequate infrastructure, but there's also still the sites that do. So this is additional homes.
Yes, it's additional homes.
To what can be built where there already is.
Yeah, if there's infrastructure, I don't think,
Which might hit our goal, but.
yeah, I don't think, let's put it this way, if I have a project and there's roads and sewers and everything, and all I want is, I'd like CHIP to build sidewalks.
Yeah.
I don't think I'd get anywhere. I think it's a backbone infrastructure program. Yes,
Can I share my thoughts?
please. I shared mine. You can share yours.
I came into this session already working on this program with Let's Build Homes and others who were supportive of this type of, specific project, TIF. And I absolutely agree that we need to have a relationship with Ways and Means. I'm a firm believer of respect goes both ways, and I think we need to be really honest with ourselves that the only reason we have this amendment is because Ways and Means did not respect our work, they did not respect Commerce's work. And they went far beyond their jurisdiction to come up with the Ways and Means amendment. I've sat in this room for the last 2 years being told, I can't talk about the tiers, I can't talk about land use. That's not housing. And then all of a sudden we get a Ways and Means amendment that is policy, not just money and taxes. It is policy decisions. I'm frustrated that the process is still broken after 2 years of fighting the same issue. And so do I believe that this amendment is better? Yes, I do think it's better than the Ways and Means amendment. However, just like when H 641 came back from the Senate with their amendment, my first question is, does it change the intention? If the intent is changed, whether it's blatantly put out, can I still vote for it? The intention of CHIP originally, as it came through to us from the Senate, even from Commerce and for us, is that we're going to allow small developers to build the housing that we need. I don't know if that's the case with this. I understand Ways and Means needing to protect the education fund, and I am so grateful for their work and that they take that so seriously. I fundamentally don't think you can have a but for and have a cap. And every time I've talked about the cap and I have concerns about the cap, I've been told by members of Ways and Means, well, we're not even going to get near the cap. And if that's the case, I've also asked and said, okay, if we're not going to get near the cap, let's raise it. If you're telling me you are so sure we are not going to hit that cap, what are you afraid of? Why can't we raise it? But I was told that that was non-negotiable. So then I said, okay, well then let's keep the cap and take out the but for, non-negotiable. So I don't think this is a compromise. I think this is a compromise to get it passed. Because it is better than Ways and Means. I'm frustrated that once again, my voice doesn't matter. My vote doesn't matter. So now I have to go home and tell all my constituents I've been fighting for 2 years for housing. And again, one person who, or there are several people who already have theirs that come from places that are already developed. They already have housing. And it doesn't matter. But again, Act 181 didn't do anything for Fairfax. So this was a way that it could. And now I don't think small developers are not going to use this program. It's going to be an additional burden. And I am so supportive of affordable housing. I will always be supportive of affordable housing. But what about the missing middle? Again, the people who are just completely disregarded because, you know, they make just enough that they don't get any benefits. The people who are working, they have 3 jobs just to pay for a mortgage. Or, you know what, they're not paying for a mortgage, they're paying rent because there's no inventory. Please don't take any offense to this, because I was going to say it earlier and then you said it. I'm really sick of hearing we cannot let perfect be the enemy of the good, because I hear it on every bill. Every contentious
Okay.
bill, I hear it. And I'm not asking for a perfect bill. But I think our constituents are asking for change. And I think that we owe them more than this. So I'm pretty frustrated and angry because our committee worked really hard. I think our committee, again, came to compromises. I will be the first to say I didn't necessarily love the Senate language. There were absolutely no guardrails there, and that was never my intent when I introduced this language on the floor. But I think we have now put so many guardrails on this bill that they're just roadblocks. And that's really scary, knowing what our goals are, where we are in the housing in this state. And the whole point of protecting the ed fund is if you have the but for, it doesn't matter, because we're saying this wouldn't happen. This development would not happen if it were not for TIF, for the increment financing. So the money wouldn't even be going into the ed fund anyway. And I understand that that is a political dilemma, but that is something I truly believe. And I think we need to remember all of the crises that we are facing as a state. We have a healthcare crisis, we have an education crisis, we have a housing crisis, we have an affordability crisis. And fundamentally, it is my personal belief that housing would solve a lot of that. We bring in housing. If we had housing, you bring in a workforce, a younger workforce, then you have a younger demographic, which if you have a younger demographic, you're going to have less healthcare costs. If you bring more working families in, you have families that are going to go into our education system. I can't vote for this, and I won't vote for it.
Tom?
I favor this amendment over the Ways and Means amendment. There are other amendments I haven't seen yet that I might like more. I don't know. At the moment, because largely because of the rest of the bill, I would like to see this pass. If this does not pass, I do know that our original bill is over in the Senate, waiting quietly. I think we may need to consider writing a bill specific to rural housing. I don't think anybody's got the appetite to vote against a rural housing bill. I'm sure they'll find some reason to or another, but this with simpler financing options, simpler guidelines, something that is not so cumbersome that a town of under 2,000 can't build 8 units. That they need as badly as bigger towns need doesn't. So this is a start. I think we're going to be at it for a while.
Other comments before we take a vote? Yeah.
I support this bill and it may be different areas, but my constituents wanted their taxes lowered. Under all conditions, that's what they wanted to see. And if that meant that whatever we have to do to make sure that the ed fund can be stabilized with the taxes, then we in our district have to look at that and vote with what our constituents are asking. I also feel that we can vote for it and then go back and expand it next year and move forward from there. But if we leave this session and we haven't passed a bill, I think the optics are absolutely atrocious.
Thank you, Saudia.
Thank you. There's one more point of inquiry real quick. So we're just on, and I mean, at the end of the day, a procedural question, point of inquiry, this is just a straw poll. So regardless of what happens right now, it's still coming to the floor.
Right.
And we will have this conversation. They just want to hear the committee's opinion on our temperature check on what we feel about this. Is that accurate?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Well, anybody know if Joe's around? I'd like to go to a straw poll is just by raising your hands.
Mhm.
Yeah,
I think I agree that this isn't gonna do much for rural Vermont. When I think about, my towns and even what they need. They don't need mixed use units. And my heart is heavy because I just see throughout the whole bill that a lot of people are being supported and we make accommodations. And then you take the independent landlord and you make their life harder when housing is a problem. And that upsets me.
I do think, although it's going to be hard, really hard, but I think we must undertake alternative forms of financing. Just to address what you're saying, I think it's on our agenda and we know what they are. They aren't tax increment. It's just, it's got to be more direct, got to be simple. And I think we're going to have to look hard at the landlord tenant problem because I think the status quo is unacceptable for everybody. How many people, I'm gonna ask them, how many people would support this amendment? Saudia, I can't see your hand one way or the other.
Maybe it's not up.
Saudia.
Well, that might,
There it
Okay,
goes.
wait.
Did you see it?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
did.
yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Have you decided?
Might change my mind later.
Okay,
At the
8 for
moment,
the moment. Okay.
okay.
For the
For
moment,
this to
yeah,
the
For the
Ways and
moment,
Means.
okay. And how many opposed? 2. So it's 8 to 1 for the moment.
For the straw, it's
For the
straw poll.
Yeah, for the straw poll, okay. I'd like to take a break.
Yeah,
let's get yourself
I need a
completed,
break.
everybody.
Oh, because we're coming back at
We're
noon.
coming back
Yeah.
at noon.
Trying to get lunch before lunch.
What are we doing at noon? I guess that we
No,
have,
we canceled that.
We did.
we have another,
I figured,
amendment,
yeah,
from
she
the
was right.
Sibelia
Vice Chair took
and
care
some
of it.
others.
Okay.
I was gonna order food, I guess.
Okay,
but I
I'm
don't
good.
mind.
So we're back here by noon, please, for Laura Sibilia presenting the rural caucus amendment. Okay?
Will
Right.
it be the same link?
Yes, Saudia.
Okay.